Welcome to the Ure Museum of Greek Archaeology. I'm Professor Amy Smith. I'm Professor of Classical Archaeology here at the university, but I'm also the curator of the museum. I'm sorry you can't be with me here today, but hope that when we launch our next exhibit in September 21, you'll be able to come in and share all this space with us. Meanwhile, I'm going to take you on a quick tour of the museum, starting in fact with the history and some of the artifacts that we have here. So the first question people often have about the Ure Museum is it's named for and in the honor of Percy and Annie Ure, who were the department's first professor of classics. In fact, the only professor of classics back in 1911 when the University College Reading, as it was then called, had a department opening up. And then sometime later, Dr. Annie Ure, actually she came first as a student, undergraduate student, and then came back for postgraduate studies and worked in many other capacities in the university, but primarily as the mostly unpaid curator of the Ure Museum, as it was later called. Annie Dunman Hunt is her maiden name, and then after their wedding, of course, took on his name for the rest of her life, so she's more commonly known as Annie Ure. So when the museum was named the Ure Museum, it was in fact as late as 1984, long after both of them had passed away, and in their honor. It wasn't first a Greek archaeology museum, but rather it started in collaboration with the historians, especially Frank Stenton, the Museum of Archaeology, or the Museum of History and Archaeology, sort of more of a world archaeology museum that was down at the university's original campus down on London Road. And that was all fine in the teens. Then, of course, there was the pesky war in the middle of it all. And by the time we got to 1922, the Museum of Greek Archaeology had been separated from the Romano-British things that had been in the museum. So there was a separate Romano-British museum, later went into the history department, then eventually into the archaeology department. Much of it dispersed, so some of the local finds, for example, have gone to the Oxfordshire County Council and so forth. But in any case, separated out was the Museum of Greek Archaeology, as it was called. But already in that time, it had objects that were from Cyprus and from Egypt. And I'm going to show you a few of those if we go around the corner. And also on my right, a very important artifact from the history of the museum, actually donated in 1958, I believe, by none other than Her Majesty the Queen, a funerary stone to a certain Domitia Rogata that was found in Lepus Magna, probably from the 2nd century AD, but along with a lot of other artifacts, was given in the time of King George, in fact, to the royal family by the Bashar of Tripoli. And it's been in the royal estate, now it's called the Crown Estates down at Virginia Water, pretty much ever since, but some of it's been obviously relocated elsewhere. We didn't take it from the family. They gave it to us to open the building. So around the corner here, we have a little bit more of the history of the museum's collection development. In fact, images of both Percy and Annie are side by side. In fact, the image of Annie is from the week of her death, when the university finally realized, after all the work that she had done over the years on all these different aspects of the university and teaching and a lot of research, she had never had time to finish her PhD that she had started before the war. So she ended up getting a doctorate, an honorary doctorate in 1976. And within that week, in her moment of glory, like a Greek hero, having received accolades and congratulations from everyone around the world, then she passed away, but again in her prime. We tried to recreate a bit of a Percy Eurodesk. And in fact, this is dated according to a letter that we have here from our archives, dated 1938 from Martin Robertson, who was then a junior curator at the British Museum, but a local chap, and wrote this letter when he dedicated or gave us a small pot, which is sitting right next to it, a little cantharos, which is Boeotian, and that's very appropriate because Percy and Annie Ure did their primary archaeological work in a place in Boeotia, just northwest of Athens, called Ritsona. And when we were celebrating the desk and everything, again, we wanted to include Annie, and we had this lovely picture of Annie Ure sitting in a ball gown. It wasn't really her style. It was sort of a one-off picture, and her son came up and said, "It's not that my father wasn't romantic, it's just that that's not how he remembered his wife on his desk," and provided a tiny little photograph of a black figure vase fragment. And that goes hand in hand with another artifact that we have black figure fragments back there at the back of Percy's desk. There's an off-print of the first article that Annie Ure ever wrote, and it is called A Black Figure Fragment in the Dorset Museum. And so he was very proud of his wife's academic accomplishments, obviously, and that's how he remembered, with a little frame picture of that fragment on his desk. And we have that fragment there and the off-print, should anyone want to read it. I'm sure it's online. It's an off-print from the Journal of Hellenic Studies, 1922. But as I said, they worked together at excavations in Ritsona. Percy had been working there actually from 1908 with his teacher, Ronald Burroughs. What they did find were the necropolis, that is to say, where all the people were buried, and they were substantial burials from the 7th through 5th centuries primarily, that revealed lots and lots of interesting ceramics, many of which had been overlooked ceramics, to some degree still are, in the collections of the world. But thereupon, the Ure Museum became essentially a specialist place in Boeotian ceramics. Not, I should hasten to add, the items from the excavations. For those items, because Percy and Annie were good Philhellenes and they were working with and in collaboration with the Greeks, they strongly felt that things that they excavated should stay there, and they did, and they're somewhere stuffed away in the immense holdings of the Thebes Archaeological Museum. But we do have a few Boeotian antiquities that they later acquired, rather cheaply, I should say, on the market because of their interest and their awareness of the rareness of some of these artifacts. So just the fact that we are a center of Boeotian studies and have a lot of Boeotian pots, people think we nicked them all from Ritsona, but no, we didn't. If you go around the other case, I'm not going to take you there here now, but if you go around the other side of the case, you will see a mock-up of grave number 144, pretty much the last grave that they excavated in 1922, and it'll give you an idea of the relatively sparse offerings there, a bunch of fragments, some figurines, some little erybloi, little oil jars, and there were human remains that, in fact, we haven't included in our mock-up because we only did one half of the grave, and that's a good way of avoiding the image of human remains. But again, this is a mock-up of the grave. It's a sort of a reconstruction of the type of grave that they did with real objects that we have, but not the ones that originally came out of that particular tomb. If you come farther to the left of the museum as you enter, the next two cases, island cases that you see, are dedicated to Egypt on my right and Greece on my left, which are the two dominant cultures that are represented in the museum. Despite the fact that we call it the Museum of Greek Archaeology, it is maybe 1/5 Egyptian material, and as I say, also Cypriot and a little bit of Roman stuff. But we wanted to make sure that visitors would understand a little bit something about these cultures that they came from. And so our Egyptian materials, with our fabulous funeral boat made out of wood, we have Roman period artifacts, including, for example, a Roman die. Over in our case that's dedicated to Greece, we have a little bit of a map in the middle. That's a good opportunity to use coins. I hasten to add, these are not real coins. They're electroplate, excellent coins, originally copied from the British Museum, actually, that were donated to us on long-term loan from the Ashmolean, the Hebridean coin room at the Ashmolean. But they're a wonderful opportunity for us to show both the fronts and the back, the reverse and the obverse of these lovely coins, but also to situate them in their geographic space, because we did want to give impression to the fact that Greece, certainly in antiquity, was much more than just the Greek mainland. So islands here, there, and everywhere, a little bit of what's now Western Turkey, a little bit of what's now Southern Italy, Sicily, etc. It's also an opportunity to talk about interchange, both East and West. One of Percy Ure's most celebrated acquisitions, in fact, in the 1940s, 1946, is number 11 here, our so-called Pontic vessel. Pontic as in the Pontus, the Black Sea. It's a type of artifact that is still called a Pontic vessel, even though for years we've known they actually were made in Etruria. They were named Pontic originally because many of them were found there because of the great, trading back and forth. But it was in both places, actually, places where people were interested in Greek myth. And what the myth is, there's still a couple of ideas on that one. It's also called our Troilus vase, because it seems to represent Troilus, the youngest of the Trojan princes. He was the one who had to be killed, according to legend, before the Greeks could win. And so Achilles went out and ambushed him by a fountain house. This side, we have actually a little bit of a horse chase, but on the other side, we have the fountain house, and we have seemingly an ambush going on. Brian Sparks a few years ago suggested, in fact, on the moment that we launched the redesign of the museum in 2005, as his inaugural lecture, he spoke about maybe this is the story of Rhesus. Look that one up someday. In any case, so we have a few other artifacts giving an idea of the breadth and depth of culture in Greece. And I also want to highlight quickly our delicate little lead figurines that were found in masses in Sparta in the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. We have many more hiding away, carefully stored now, and the ones that we have on display are in a microenvironment that protects them theoretically from our lights, etc. And showing off the representative types, Artemis, perhaps the image of the goddess herself, both a head and a winged version of her, as well as Spartan soldiers, their helmets, their shields, and wreaths, which would have filled a sacrificial ceremonial purpose. Behind me, we have a map that shows where everything that we have a provenance in the museum came from. In many cases, our provenances are hearsay, said to be from Pompeii, because as far as we know, except for artifacts that came from the east, for example, Almina and Egypt, the Garstang and the Petri excavations, most of our artifacts didn't come out of actual excavations, which is unfortunate. But such was the collection and dissemination of artifacts, not just in Britain, but throughout the world, until the UNESCO legislation came in 1970, prohibiting things being taken out of their country of origin. And the vast majority of the objects in this collection obviously came before that time and mostly came through donations. So they came from as far and wide as Carthage in the west, off to, I guess, Nimrud in the east, and surrounding that, the discussion of the shapes and the decorative styles of mostly the Greek ceramics that we have here. But on our timeline, just below that, it's a timeline both incorporating fragments here and incorporating the full vases down below that are put approximately in the chronological order in which they were made. So the oldest vases down there, about 3,300 BC, and the most recent vases, this is where we get into some of our Roman things, about AD 400. And so representing the three cultures, Greece, Egypt, Rome, on our timeline, we've got some basic historical events that happened in those times, again, to help people understand what's going on. When we redesigned the museum in 2005, we had to attend to thematic representation that would cater to the educational needs, starting with Key Stage 2, so that's the 9 to 12-year-olds, all the way up to our mature learners. And for our themes, which I'm now going to take you through, we decided to basically dedicate each one of our wall cases to that theme. Having now, as I've suggested, in the middle of the museum with the island cases, introduce people to the museum, what it holds, its history, etc. And so we had to think quite hard about how to represent these particular themes, both across Greece and Egypt, and a little bit of Cyprus and Rome. And we thought the most important thing would be to start with myth and religion, where obviously there's great differences between how the Greeks and Egyptians did things, but some things that they had very much in common. Great interest in reverence for their gods. And so we've got the divine up at the top, the sort of heroic and monster sphere in the middle, and then the humble worshippers down below doing their thing. And that's represented by some of our Cypriot figurines showing votives, figures that are seemingly bringing gifts to the gods. Like one's got a little kid or lamb, one's got a little symbol, maybe music, some amulets, mostly Egyptian, but one that's actually a late antique Christian cross, an offering plate, and even a couple of nails that came. I talked earlier about the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, a couple of nails that came from Dawkins excavations down there through the British School at Athens. And then the next case flows from that. Greeks and Egyptians, like their divinities, their gods, came in families, and families assembled in households. So this case is dedicated to the household. We've got some vessels that seem to be associated with weddings, for example, here, as well as death, some childhood-related artifacts. But on the other side, just some of the stuff that you'd find in the household. And somewhere in the middle, a big vat of water. This is a hydria, a water vessel that obviously would have been used to carry water from the well. In Greece, education came in the form of music, for both genders, in fact, for athletics, and, of course, a little bit of literacy thrown in there. not everyone got to learn how to read or write. But obviously music is important, and this is a great opportunity for us to remember Dr. John Landels, who was one of our great 20th century scholars who brought music and science to the Ure Museum, to the Department of Classics at Reading, and in fact wrote some still well-known and well-consulted books on the matter. And in his time, one of his PhD students donated to the Ure Museum some of the string instruments that actually someone in her family made. This is Helen Roberts. So we have little lyre, the schoolboy instrument, well, younger elite boys probably learned on, the kithara, which was more of a concert instrument, and down when we get to the symposium, the barbitos, the Lydian lyre, as it is. But these are 1972 instruments made very authentically like the ancient instruments. So this is an actual tortoiseshell, for example, on the tortoiseshell lyre. But they aren't particularly easy to play, and they don't pretend to be the real thing, but it's good to have them. On the other side of the education case, we have literacy, and I should highlight the most recent artifact that came into the Ure Museum, again, through a donation, this time in memory of Marjorie Homan. So we call it the Homan tablet, but it's an Egyptian writing tablet from Roman time, written in Greek. So it covers all of our bases, essentially. And it's really important because, of course, as the Department of Classics, the writing of languages is one of the most important things that we do and that we talk about, even though we don't have a lot of it in the museum, actually representing that aspect of culture. And we also have a couple of Egyptian artifacts, most importantly, interestingly, some scribbles on the back of an artist's slate. And then in this case, we do citizenship. Now, back in 2004 to 5, when we designed this, it was very important to have citizenship in the UK curriculum. I hope it still is. But it's a very hard thing to represent, in fact, in a museum context. And so we did citizenship with a small c, because, of course, in Athens, for example, citizenship wouldn't have brought too many people into the picture. But we try to represent how we've got different levels of society. We've got an amazing image on a South Italian vase, actually, of someone being taken as a prisoner of war. We also have our aristocrats going off and doing a little bit of hunting. But then on the other end of the spectrum, we have ways in which the women would have been represented. We've got our Maenads in the circle of Dionysus, but we've got other women who are holding, again, more offerings and participating in religion, maybe cutting across all of these strata of society. The essential oil jar that is in fact called the alabastron, named for alabaster in Egypt. Our glass one was found in Egypt and came here in 1947 and was donated subsequently to the Ure Museum. The other vessels, we don't know exactly where they came from, but some of them are simple ceramics, one in fact made out of alabaster, all the same size and shape, well, give or take. And in fact, some glass vessels, just like our blue and white 5th century BC Egyptian one, were found in the tombs at Ritsona that Percy and Annie had excavated that I told you about earlier. Our next case deals with another aspect of citizenship that many people know much more about, actually, if they've read any of the ancient epics, that is warfare. And again, we did a sort of tripart division. We thought about the infantry, we thought about cavalry, which is particularly prominent, I suppose, in the lore of Athens, and we thought about the seamanship. So there's very few representations of the seamen in action because, in fact, they tended to be slaves, right? The people who could afford art, shall we say, they were the people who might have owned a boat, and many of the boats, of course, were dedicated by a wealthy person to the service of the country or the city or whatever. But we have plenty of representations of the cavalry and what we could essentially call infantry. We've also included two of our great Egyptian treasures here, not original, I hasten to add, but plaster casts, painted plaster casts of some of the relief decoration from the tombs associated with Queen Hatshepsut in the 13th dynasty, showing obviously the infantry, and again, we get some sailors that way. Talking about different levels of society, we couldn't miss the opportunity to include the Symposium. Not least because the Symposium, though it's a peculiarly Greek and especially Athenian concept, it is an opportunity to use many, many vessels, which of course we have in the museum, since our prominent artifacts are the pots that they made, that they drank out of, etc. And when we were designing this case, in fact, Martin Andrews, our designer, challenged us with particular questions about who would be handling the artifacts. Needless to say, my answer was, well, the slaves, the servants. Where did they bring them from? The larder. So here's our larder, where you put as many vessels as you possibly can. Great opportunity to show off more rather than less, and avoid that traditional museological tendency to put most of the things away in the storage area. But we had to put at the center of the case the punch bowl of antiquity, essentially the crater, in which they would have mixed their water out of a hydria and their wine out of an amphora. And in fact, over here, we have a ladle from the Middle Helladic period that would have been used to take the wine out and pour it into the cups, of which we have many over here. We decorated the floor with a mosaic. It's a photograph of mosaic, famously found, this one in Rome, in the Vatican museums, in fact, called the unswept floor mosaic, that represents the artifacts that would have been dropped by the symposiasts in the middle of their party. We've almost reached the final case, which is death, but a good transition between the symposium and death is, in fact, the concept of the body beautiful. Again, something that the Greeks and Egyptians did different ways, but shared, celebrating the body in terms of makeup, hair, face, how you dress up, etc. And this is an opportunity to show off lots of our, especially Greek vessels, that have images of pretty ladies on them, their heads. And at the center of the case, painted beautifully on the table, painted by Martin Andrews, again our designer, essentially a toilet where you would have had the artifacts that would have been used for sustaining that beauty, a couple of mirrors, a couple of combs, pins, etc. We have some jewelry off in the corner, both Greek and Egyptian. And most importantly, in the concept of health and beauty, I suppose, one of the two strigils that we have, the strigils were these artifacts that were used, bronze scoops, used to scrape off the accumulated sweat and grease and grime, and of course oil that you would put on your body before the athletic activity. That was a way of cleaning off in antiquity. And finally, as promised, our death case, which we tried to accentuate with essentially the entrance that looks a bit like some of the tombstones represented on our Panathenaic vases here. They're not real Panathenaic vases, but pseudo-Panathenaic vases. Two of the 300 artifacts that we have actually on loan from the Reading Museum. We have a couple of symbols associated with death, so sirens, sphinxes, and perhaps most importantly, in the middle, unifying the Greek material with the Egyptian material over there, this amazing tombstone from Abydos from the late period, so 4th century BC or later, showing a nice Hellenistic lady, Greek lady, dressed in her very Greek-style hair, her Greek-style robe, between Anubis and Osiris, the gods of the underworld in Egypt. And our most favorite object from the collection in Liverpool, our cat's head. So someone found this cat on the docks at Liverpool, where it had been literally dumped off of a boat from Egypt to be used by farmers as manure. But they thought this cat was worth something a little bit more and put it inside, and we still have the Victorian glass jar. And it's been scanned, in fact, received a CAT scan as well as other scientific analysis as part of the ancient Egyptian animal biobank in which it plays a part. We finished our tour of the permanent gallery of the museum, but we also have an opportunity for temporary displays, sometimes curated by students, sometimes by others. And our display here, Egypt in Reading, celebrates what I've already talked about a little bit. Some of the artifacts we have from Liverpool, from John Garstang's excavations, and also artifacts that we have from the BSAE, the British School of Archaeology in Egypt. And really interesting history behind them that you can read more about or hear more about if you go to the exhibitions part of our website. In the autumn, we will be replacing it with a spotlight loom from the British Museum called Troy, Beauty and Heroism that will be taking up room in this display case and a brand new, now empty display case in the entrance that we're going to be filling over the summer.